Hi, I'm Susan Klumpner, and welcome to this Trauma-Informed Community Coach Training Workshop. In the following virtual modules, we will provide a foundation for trauma-informed education, as well as practical strategies community instructors can use when working with youth that have experienced trauma in their lives. This training was developed for coaches, volunteers, and non-professional educators that work with children in diverse settings. It provides an introduction to the complexity of how people carry emotional trauma in their lives and offers guidance on how to apply trauma-informed practices in informal educational settings. While much of the content in this course addresses how youth experience trauma in a general sense, we specifically investigate how participation in sports and how interactions with a supportive adult coach can be a powerful intervention for children suffering both acute and past trauma. As a trained social worker, nonprofit administrator, and associate director of field education at the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice, I've spent my career working with historically oppressed and marginalized communities. In 2013, I co-founded the ACE Project, a youth development organization that provides free after-school programs to under-resourced communities in Chicago, Baltimore, and Detroit. To carry out our mission, we hire and train adults who live or work in the local school community as our after-school practitioners, thereby providing paid opportunities as well as building an identifiable network of supportive and caring adults who live down the street from our participants. Through working with grassroots community programs, it's clear that both the children we serve and adults whom we employ are affected by past traumas, and that much of our job as coaches and mentors is to provide support and connection that can lessen the burden of this emotional weight. I've seen the transformative positive impact joining a team and participating in sport can have on a child and community. And I've also witnessed the distress a negative interaction can have when a coach is unprepared to navigate challenging student relationships. The objective of this course is to recognize that all children bring physical and emotional histories with them to the tennis court, soccer field, computer lab, or art studio. Beyond this, histories of tragedy, abuse, and fear can often be hidden behind smiles and laughter. No matter what the context, coaches and community instructors have a responsibility to enter these important relationships with the tools and context to ensure their students can access the safety and positivity that sports and out-of-school recreation can provide. Before I introduce our trauma expert, I want to make it clear that this course is just the beginning of these conversations, and that part of our development as coaches and youth sport providers is to really consider our footprint and how teams and organizations can engage and institutionalize these strategies. There's no magic pill, light switch, or box to check that can ensure that we are trauma-informed mentors. It's a lifelong process that will continue to evolve through thoughtful preparation and personal reflection. Taking this course is a great first step to maximizing the benefits students get from your classes. Beyond just providing tools and knowledge, though, we hope it will inspire conversations that lead coaches and community instructors to see themselves as educators and to fully understand the value they can bring to vulnerable children's lives. So thank you for taking this step with us, and we are eager to support the important work you do every day. So with that, I'm excited to introduce my colleague, Dr. Mays Imad, neuroscientist and national expert on trauma-informed education. Mays, before we jump into things, can you tell us a little about yourself and your work in trauma-informed education?
Thank you, Susan, and I want to thank you for the work that you do and for your passion and for empowering so many people through knowledge and opportunities. I'm grateful to be here. So my background training is in neuroscience. I look at the world through the lens of the brain. In particular, I am interested in what makes an optimal learning environment. So I'm in the classroom, I work with students, and I was born in Iraq. I lived through several wars, and I had to leave the country with my family. And so as a refugee, I have, let's say, I endured my own share of traumas. And it impacted the way I show up to school, to work. And I had no idea that there is such a thing as a trauma-informed care or education until I began to work with my students. And a lot of times I saw in my students what I was undergoing, and I began to investigate with them the role of stress and self-awareness and regulation on their ability to learn and thrive. So I feel quite passionate about this work. And I think it is an opportunity to empower young people to cope and continue to move forward and develop mental immunity.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, so I've said the word trauma, and you've just mentioned trauma as well. So before we begin, sort of, what is trauma, and why is it important for us to know anything or care about it?
That's a great question. So I love starting with definitions. And here we're talking about psychological or emotional trauma. So something happens and I have a reaction to it, an event or a series of events. Now it's important to remember that it's not just any event. It's a negative event, and it's not just negative. To my nervous system, to my entire being, it feels shocking. It feels threatening to my survival. And so that event, in the moment it happens or even after it happens, it puts us in a position of helplessness. We can't do anything about it. We feel out of control. And then this negative, shocking event also makes us question basic assumptions we have about the world, the safety of the world, our place in the world. All of that culminates in what? It depletes us of energy. The brain is stuck trying to figure out what happened, how threatening it is, where do we stand, betrayal. It depletes, it uses a lot of energy, so it depletes us of energy, and as a result, we feel this sense of, we feel overwhelmed and we feel exhausted. Now, why do we feel exhausted? As I said, it's a negative event. It's a shocking event that makes us question our survivability. And so there is a fear component. And that fear will then trigger a series of physiological domino effect that uses a lot of energy to keep us alive, if you will.
Yeah, I see. So you said that it's a negative sort of experience, right? And what other kind of negative physical or psychological things can happen to us if we experience trauma?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it's important to note that, and you asked me, why should we care about trauma? It's important to note that there is a very strong bidirectional body brain connections. So what happens in the brain impacts the body and vice versa. So what happens when we experience an event as being traumatic and threatening to our survival, not only is the brain going to react, but the brain is going to impact the rest of the body. And so every organ system in the body is going to be impacted. If we don't pay attention to the trauma, if we don't resolve it, metabolize it, process it, we may momentarily be able to compartmentalize and put it behind us. The body, however, does not. So there is quite a bit of literature and research highlighting that the body keeps a score, highlighting that when we continue to ignore it, the body reaches a point where it says no, not anymore. So there is correlation between cancer and trauma, between obesity and trauma, definitely longevity, and it can even extend not just in this generation, but to the next generation if we don't, again, work with it, metabolize it, try to heal from it.
Yeah. And generational trauma is definitely something that I know and hope that we talk about. But I'm just also sort of wondering, you've given some examples of different types of trauma. Are all traumas the same, and in what ways are they similar or different?
Yes, so that's a great question. So yes and no. On the one hand, all traumas are going to have three, what we call the 3 E's, 3 common denominators. There is an event that happens. There is the experience of that event, how it feels, and then the effect on the nervous system. So we could look at every traumatic event and look at the 3 E's. On the other hand, not every trauma is the same. Why is that? We can categorize the type of trauma. So for example, we can categorize them based on the complexity of the event, if you will. So we have acute trauma. This is something that happens, it's an isolated experience, it happens once. But then we also have chronic trauma. This is something that's sustained and it's a prolonged, repeated experiences. And then we have some scholars talk about complex trauma. So complex trauma is when we get exposed to multiple traumatic events from early age. And then there is the historical or intergenerational trauma. This is where a collective group of individuals, communities experience the trauma across generations. So an example would be, for example, racism experienced by the African American community, for instance. So again, it's important to, if we are in trying to help individuals and community, it's important to understand all those nuances of trauma.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I know the communities that we serve are typically communities of color living in under-resourced sort of neighborhoods, and they're at a greater risk of experiencing disproportionately high rates of trauma than some of their white counterparts, for example. So what individuals or communities are at the highest risk of facing these types of traumatic events? And then similarly, talking about generational trauma, right? How can trauma be passed down from one generation to the next?
Yes, those are great questions. And we know from research, from the literature on trauma, that communities who have been historically and systematically marginalized, they tend to be impacted more by traumatic experiences. Now, why is that? Well, exclusion is incredibly overwhelming on the brain. We're very social creatures. We depend on others for our survivability. And when you are excluded systematically and your community, and there's violence and oppression, that's really, this is what I was talking about earlier when I said it makes us question basic assumptions about the world and our place in it. So we know that. We also know that communities from low socioeconomic background, poverty can be really traumatic. So those factors are important because race, education, class, culture, those are all factors that can complicate that complex trauma. They intersect those factors, and you have one trauma added on another trauma and so on. Now, with respect to the intergenerational, so we don't just pass on our genetic material to our offspring. We also pass on how that genetic material interacts with the environment. And so we know that the DNA is influenced by the environment. The DNA behavior is impacted if we're under a lot of stress. So if the previous generation was suffering from a lot of trauma, it changes the way their DNA interacts. Metabolism, for example, anxiety baseline, for example, that then gets passed on to the next generation.
Wow. Yeah, thank you so much for explaining something that is just so complicated and not so easy for me to sort of just understand without having a neuroscience background.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times science, our understanding of science is evolving. So at one point we thought it's all about the genes. We pass them on and the genes are okay, and then we learned from the technological advancement helped us understand science and molecular biology so much more. So now we have a more understanding of the nature-nurture relationships.
So understanding our familial background is really important, right? Our family history, understanding the context is really important, and understanding sort of the way that our intersectional identities influence the work that we do and sort of how we show up for the kids that we work with. When you talked a little bit about the brain, it reminded me of this study that so many of us have heard about, right? Mm-hmm. It's the ACEs study. Mm-hmm. And I believe ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Can you maybe talk a little bit about what we have learned from that study, or what should we know about that?
Yes, so that's a great question, and it's a really important study. It's one of the largest longitudinal study that has been done, and it looked at the experiences of children, particularly experiences that are called adverse, negative, that happened during those really formative years of their development, and how those experiences then impact them later on. And so the study looked to see, are there any correlation between the number of adversities or adverse experiences I had as a child, and then what happens later on, for example, with my education or with my overall well-being or with my mental health. And we know that there's a strong correlation between those two. So the more adversities a child encounters, the more likely that they're going to struggle with mental health later on in their lives, among other factors. Now, why is it important to pay attention to it? Because, and you mentioned, context is so important. So a lot of times what was happening, for example, in school, a child was coming and not perhaps performing well or not paying attention. And there are all these assumptions that we were making about the child, about their behavior, without really looking, taking a step back and saying, what happened to this child, right? How can we help? So the context is critical for relationality, for understanding.
Yeah, and so thank you for mentioning relationally, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to wrap my brain around, being a coach and trying to relate with some of the children and the families that we work with and some of my other fellow coaches. So how can we apply sort of a trauma lens to our relational approach with the youth that we coach and serve?
That's a really important question. So if I had a trauma lens, that means I have an understanding of what trauma is and how it shows up. And the consequences, one consequence of that is asking more accurate questions. So rather than jumping in and asking, what's wrong with you? I'm going to ask, what happened to you? And then even further, what is right with you? Come up with all of the things that are right and brilliant, and then asking, how might I help? Now, psychological trauma is a relational problem. There's a break in a relationship. There's a break in a relationship with society, with a person, with knowledge, with our understanding. So a lot of scholars say that the healing is in relationships. And a lot of the research from the ACE that you mentioned, so yes, we could use the ACE as a predictor for what's going to happen later on in life, but it's not always going to necessarily predict negative or adversity in adulthood. One factor that's remarkable is if a child had even one anchor, one healthy relationship. It could be a grandma, it could be a teacher. And there's a really powerful interview with Oprah Winfrey, and she had a lot of adversities growing up. And she's asked, what was it? And she says, I remember it was one incident, one teacher, and that teacher made me feel seen, made me feel connected. And it was that made the pivot. So, and we're going to talk about the brain, but the brain is really malleable and adaptable, especially for younger people. And so we have the opportunity to shift the focus of the brain from the adversity and the trauma and the exhaustion to something that is more positive.
And so this anchor, right? And I like this idea of this anchor. Mm-hmm. Could this anchor be a coach?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. It's any adult that can offer connections, safety, trust. It could be, and I would say a coach can bring so much of those positive factors, those protective factors.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mays.
Thank
you for joining us today. And we hope our discussion gave you a better understanding of how trauma develops and is carried in people's lives. In the next class, we'll be discussing the body's stress response system and how youth cognitive and emotional development is affected by trauma. We look forward to continuing with you in Module 2.